Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bipin Kumar. I am a volunteer at CSPC, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's panel, Maintaining Trust in Publicized Scientific Research, hosted by Canadian Science Publishing. I would like to now pass on to Dr. David Moher, who will be the moderating this panel. David, on to you.
Okay, thank you, Bipin, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening, depending on what part of the country you're living in. And so it's my pleasure to moderate the session today. And what I'm going to do first is read our land acknowledgement. I'm grateful to the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose unceded and unsurrendered territory I make my home in Ottawa, but I'm privileged to join you today from Toronto, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and home today to many Indigenous people. And just to let everybody know that we'll be taking questions throughout the Q&A features on Zoom and also on the chat. And what I'm going to do now is introduce the panelists who I very much appreciate taking the time oh, I see we're going to have the poll first, so my apologies. So if everybody could take a moment and actually just complete this poll, that would be really wonderful. And we're going to share the results, and I see there are some people coming from outside the UK, outside Canada, excuse me. So welcome from the UK. Nice to see that we're going outside of our country. So I think we're going to give people about a minute and a half to answer the question, and so I'll hold off introducing the panelists until we perhaps get an answer to the polling question. As I understand, it will be made. There's somebody coming from Egypt. Wonderful. Nice hot weather. Maybe you could send that over to Canada. Okay, so here we go. How would you rate the current level of trust in science? And so it seems to me that 41% of those who responded seem to have a high level, and 35% have a moderate level, and 2% have a very low level, and 7% have a very high level. So thank you for taking the time to do that poll. And now I'm going to introduce the panelists. Kea Motter is Head of Academic Affairs North America at Springer Nature, where she leads academic affairs activities in the United States and Canada, building relationships and collaborations with funders, institutions, and other non-profit organizations in the region. Kea has a background in publishing, having held editorial positions in Elsevier and Wiley. In recent years, her work has been centered on open science development, policy and outreach, with a topical focus on research assessment reform, research integrity, AI, and other issues impacting the research community. So welcome, Kea, and thank you for your time and expertise. Next on our list of panelists is Sarah Eaton. Sarah is a professor and research chair at the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary in Canada. Dr. Eaton leads transdisciplinary research teams focused on integrity and ethics in educational context. Dr. Eden also holds a concurrent appointment as an honorary associate professor, Deakin University in Australia. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you again for your time and expertise. The third member of the panel is Juan Pablo Alperin, and he's an associate professor in the School of Publishing, the scientific director of the Public Knowledge Project, and co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab at Simon Fraser University, also in Canada. He is a multidisciplinary scholar who uses a combination of computational techniques and traditional qualitative methods to investigate ways of raising scientific quality, global impact, and public use of scholarly work. So welcome, Juan Pablo. It's great to have you. It's earlier in the day for you, so drink your coffee. And the last member of our panel is Natasha MacDonald. And Natasha is responsible for advancing the system of peer review at Canadian Science Publishing to yield a more inclusive, transparent, and rigorous research output. She is passionate about open science and is a proponent of challenging long-held narratives in scientific publishing that have led to underrepresentation of researchers from a number of communities and regions. Before moving into scholarly publishing, she held a career as a researcher in the field of marine biogeochemistry. I confess I have no idea what that is, but it sounds really good. He currently serves as a Higher Education Sustainability Initiative UN SDG Publishers Impact Fellow. So welcome, Natasha, as well. And thank you for joining this wonderful panel. My job is going to be to try to moderate this panel as best as I can. So thank you to all of the audience who completed the poll on sort of trust in science. And I think just to sort of give some context, I do read the literature quite a bit. A couple of things that I've sort of read that sort of lead me to wonder. So one of the papers I read probably 18 months ago, that in 2023, there were more than 10,000 retractions in the literature. And is that a big percentage of the literature, or a tiny percent? Is it something we need to worry about? And more recently this year, I read a paper in Nature that seemed to imply that there were more than 400,000 articles that were generated from paper mills. So I'm sort of wondering, what are your thoughts? Should we keep trusting science, trusting researchers? And maybe first I'll send that over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks so much for your introductory remarks, David. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile asking ourselves what might be the drivers of some of these paper mill activities and fraud and corruption in publishing in general. And probably I should offer a little bit of a preamble and say, when we talk about things like paper mills, we're not talking about accidental plagiarism. And we're not talking about unintentional breaches of research integrity, failure to cite and reference, or sloppy scholarship. When we talk about paper mills, we're talking about an intention or a deliberate act on the part of the scientist or the scholar to use fraudulent mechanisms to increase their citations and other types of gains. And a question we might want to ask is cui bono, like who benefits from paper mill activities? And it could be the researchers from increased metrics or the appearance of increased metrics or citations of their work or increased publication rates, and also the paper mills themselves. Who doesn't benefit is scientific institutions, universities, and the scientific community as a whole. So those are, sort of some foundational pieces to sort of think about. One, who benefits, and to what are the drivers of this kind of fraud, and thinking about the commercialized production of science that's happening at scale, that's through paper mills. And then as a result, mass retractions as a way of trying to pull back or correct the scientific record when paper mill products make it through peer review. So there's vulnerability points along the continuum from the genesis of a scientific output or knowledge mobilization to when it reaches the public. And so what are those vulnerable points along that process continuum that might require intervention or attention?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Maybe, Kia, I can ask you whether you sort of wanted to add to what Sarah is saying.
Yeah. So in answer to your question, I do think that there are many reasons why we should trust researchers who are sharing their results. Those two headlines that you shared, you see those numbers, you hear those numbers, and it can sound pretty challenging and scary when you're hearing those numbers, but without the necessary context. And it's true, as Sarah mentioned, that there are cases of research misconduct, fraudulent behavior, but we also have to acknowledge that not every retraction, not every paper that's flagged is the result of misconduct or fraudulent behavior. And so we don't want to, stigmatize the act of retracting manuscripts. We need to really flip the narrative and reward researchers who are coming forward to correct the literature, because it's important. And I also, as you said, I'm speaking from the perspective of a large publisher. So I wanted to put some things in context from that perspective, from our perspective. Of course, this is just one perspective, but last year, for example, we received more than 2.3 million article submissions. So it's a very high volume that we're managing. And of those submissions, we published just under 500,000 manuscripts. And during that same time period, we retracted 2,923 published articles. So, of course, those numbers sound quite large, but to put that in perspective, the number of retractions represents just 0.6% of the total volume of published articles. So, and when we look at the broader industry average, there has been some data recently that shows that over the last decade, of the 50 million articles that were published, about 40,000 or less than 0.1% of those have been retracted. So I'm sharing that data both from our perspective as a commercial publisher, but also from the industry as a whole, just to put things in a little bit of context there, so that, while we do tend to focus on these numbers, we need to also look at it in context. And remember that retractions are still, a relatively rare event. And finally, the other point I wanted to make was that, in terms of science communication, it's really integral to our trust in science, the way we communicate science. And we do really need to think about the way that we communicate science and change the way we communicate about science. I was interested to see the results of the poll just now, because I think that's more or less in line with some recent polls that have been done on trust in science. The Pew Charitable Trust recently released survey results that showed that actually trust in science has moderately improved over the last year, but it's still not quite at the level that it was pre-pandemic. So there's still some work that needs to be done there. But the other thing I found interesting about the Pew survey results is that only 43% of those surveyed think that scientists are good at communicating their results. So, if that percentage were higher, would we see more confidence in science? I mean, I would probably argue yes. And I think it's important to understand that both the lay public and policymakers need to understand how science is conducted. They need to understand that science is iterative and that new findings can sometimes overturn the assumptions of the past. And that the conventional wisdom of the day may need to be updated as new results are communicated. So I think, with that awareness, I think that we can certainly try to improve confidence in science. And, obviously I'm speaking from the perspective of a publisher, but I think we're actively trying to flip that narrative and to work on the way we communicate about retractions.
Thank you, Kea. And I would like to sort of invite Juan Pablo or Natasha if they had anything else they would like to add to Sarah and Kea's comments.
I can add. So some of the things that have been said is I very much agree with in terms of both trying to understand what are the root causes of some of the reasons why, who's benefiting, and what are some of the misincentives of the that are leading to these kind of the adverse effects of people being motivated to intentionally commit fraud, either through paper mill, by publishing things that are produced through paper mills, or otherwise. And I do also want to, again, emphasize this already been said, so I won't belabor it, but the question around what's the proportion of the literature that's actually affected compared to what the vast majority of scientists and the amount of people that are actually trying to, the research that is being produced today is being done from people operating with integrity and with best intentions. So things, unintentional integrity issues do occur, but again, most of those are coming from people operating with best intentions, and mistakes get made and sometimes corrected. And so those are just kind of to emphasize those points that have already been made. But to answer the original question, I think the question around, should we keep trusting science and trusting researchers? And my answer is that we don't really have another choice. I think this is, as a society, this is the institution of science, is the institution that we've entrusted and asked to create knowledge and help us to better understand the world. And so it's great for us, from those of us that are working from within science, to make sure that we're paying attention to these things that are happening, even if they're still a small minority of what's being done within science, but to not get caught up in sort of putting all of science in that bucket of where the misconduct is happening. I think there's an emphasis and a clear need for us to avoid sort of creating a moral panic and us internally starting to doubt whether the processes of science and the people working from within science are actually, on the whole, operating with good intentions and trying to create knowledge to the best of their ability. So I think I can probably leave it there for now. I think that in another question, we can talk a little bit more about what is, I think, some of the more positive responses that we can take. Because I don't think that we need to, from within science, turn a blind eye to say, pretend like this isn't happening because we want to trust in what we're doing. And we don't want to underplay it either, but we need to be careful about how we talk about it. Because if we start casting doubt on ourselves, when I think on the whole, scientists working from within might believe that this is a problem, but they don't believe that science is fundamentally on the whole broken. And so we need to be careful to not be projecting that image to those that have less knowledge of the inner workings of science, to then start discarding or undervaluing what it is that we're doing when we're trying to sort of formally create knowledge within the processes and using the scientific processes and institutions that we have in place.
Thank you, Juan. Appreciate it. Natasha, is there anything that you sort of wanted to add to the question or comments that
Sure.
we've heard?
Yeah, I just wanted to expand a little bit on comments that were made about the need for communication and the iterative nature of science. And I think that we see a disconnect between how we talk about science and research and theory and as researchers and publishers and policymakers and the message that we convey to the general public through actions. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that the current system of assessing research, how do we know, if researchers are successful, doesn't always in practice support that notion that science should be something that's constantly evolving and changing, and it gets refined and reassessed. And I think that the general public isn't yet privy to that paradigm shift that we talk about internally. And so I think a good example of this is during the pandemic, researchers and institutions would issue recommendations based on the science available at the moment. And then when new data became available and conclusions and recommendations evolved and changed, instead of fostering and instilling trust that, yes, science is working in the way it's meant to, a lot of the public felt the opposite. They felt this deep mistrust. They said, you're saying this, but previously you said that. And so I think that we need to, along these thoughts about communication, continue to push this paradigm shift that needs to be communicated to the public, so that they can have this mental shift about the iterative nature of science. That has to happen for them too, I think.
Thank you. That's great. So I think that's been a good discussion, and I think now we'll just sort of turn this over in terms of there's some Q&As here. I think one attendee has asked Kia whether you could provide the link to the Pew poll that you mentioned, or the URL or a documentation. So thank you for doing that. One of an earlier question is thoughts about researchers that choose to publish in paper mills due to a lack of funding. Sarah, I think you gave us some thoughts on paper mills, and maybe I'll ask you if you're comfortable to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely clear on the question, but maybe I can offer a couple of reflections. I mean, people would generally pay to work with a paper mill. And then in terms of the lack of funding, I'm not sure if that's the question is, are people trying to artificially inflate their publication record, their personal publication record, or their citations in order to look better on grant applications? I think it's difficult to know the motivations for folks who do work with paper mills. There can be a number of different things that come into play there, but certainly, thinking about like what might be the ultimate goal for someone to reach out to an organization like a paper mill to work with them, that there must be some benefit.
I'm wondering, Sarah, whether the person is sort of is asking whether going the route of paper mills would negate the author processing charges.
I see. Yeah, what you're asking. That might be a little difficult to sort of get a cause and effect kind of relationship there to it. And I should mention I'm also a journal editor, and I don't know that we've seen too much evidence of that, but maybe somebody else wants to weigh in on that question.
I know, Juan Pablo, you had your hand up and you took it down. So
no, just I think there might be in the question there, like thinking around paper mills, but also thinking about what are often talked about as predatory journals. And I want to point out that there's a couple of things that this makes me think of. One is that we see that the adverse effects of article processing charges and what that does in terms of creating incentives for the creation of things like predatory journals or journals that are trying to essentially offer some quick publication publication, often at a lower cost than what the some of the traditional publishers charge for their APC. So maybe that's maybe mixed up in the question there. But to say that those are the kinds of things that we need to address around how the things that we've created around how we do research assessment and how we do research publishing that are contributing to some of these problems. But the second similarity I wanted to point out is that we also saw, and it's maybe now there's a little less attention to it, but a few years ago, there was also a bit of a moral panic around predatory publishing and those practices, when in fact it continues to also first be a small proportion of what is being published out there, and that there is, as a research community, we're pretty good at being able to actually identify what is good research and what isn't, and that the venue of publication doesn't act as much of an actual signal of what it is that whether the research itself is good or not. And so I just wanted to point out that there's a similar sort of outrage that happens from within the scientific community around these practices that remain a small proportion, and that we keep undermining ourselves and what we're doing on the whole when that isn't the bulk of the publishing, and it doesn't cause as much of a problem for the scientific community as the headlines would have us believe.
Thank you. I'll just go quickly to another question. Is there any policy in place to identify and counteract dis and misinformation in published science? Is there anybody who would like to sort of take on that question?
I was going to speak about this a little bit later on, but there are some initiatives that are happening industry-wide related to how retractions are, like standards around retractions, how they're labeled, standardizing the metadata, but also using technology to provide a feedback mechanism so that, if there are changes made to the version of record on the publisher's website, that those changes are then also communicated to other platforms or repositories where the content might be hosted. So I think those two things are good examples of attempts that are being made to ensure that information doesn't get cited without the user being aware that there might be an expression of concern related to the article, or that it may have been retracted, and essentially trying to create more transparency in the scholarly communications ecosystem across platforms about to make sure that content isn't being inadvertently reused in a way that perpetuates problems with the research. Now, that's just one example. I mean, there are probably other examples out there as well.
Right. Thank you, Kea. I mean, I would also just say that journals typically have processes in place to look for plagiarism. And obviously, one way that we'd like to think about minimizing misinformation is expert peer review. I wanted to go to another question on public understanding of science and the relationship between public understanding of science and public trust in science. What are your thoughts on what appears to be in some circles to be growth in citizenship science? And does anybody from the panel want to take that? Or it's quite fine to pass on the question too if you don't want to take it.
I'd be happy to speak to it.
Thank you, Juan Pablo.
One, as I see citizen science or community science, and there's also citizen sort of community engaged science. There's different sort of variations and models for how to do a better job of integrating and working together with the public as a way of building in those relationships and opening up the sort of institutions of science to society. For me, this is actually the definition of or the part of open science that gets me the most excited, even though often we pay a lot of attention to open access, to preprints, to open data. But I think that this part around opening up to other actors in society is one of the fundamental opportunities that the questions of open science brings to the table. And I think it's crucial. And this is where I think that we need to have a positive response to these challenges around research integrity. It is around helping the public better understand the processes by which we do science. How do we internally try to make sure that we validate? And so peer review, as you mentioned, David, is a crucial part of that. The processes that a publication will go through as it tries to get out are a key part of that. And I think that this is trying to work more closely with society and making sure that every piece of research that gets done has that kind of opportunities for public input. And well, actually, I shouldn't say every piece, but it's like in places where it's appropriate or where it makes sense to have that kind of public input. So I'll add one more bit, which is, to mention an initiative that we're trying to champion with the Public Knowledge Project, and David, we're working in collaboration with this as well. So, but to say that we're trying to help make the processes of what goes on at journal publications more transparent. As a way, I think key to that is that it be a way of helping to build that public understanding of the scientific process. We saw a lot of this during the pandemic. There was more pieces in mainstream media around the inner workings of science than I'd ever seen in my life. It became so much easier to explain what it is that I do in my job by being able to point to pieces published in mainstream media outlets around how the scientific process works. And so we've been championing this idea of a publication facts label as a way of journals just being more transparent around how they operate. And so I think we need to have this question of the public's understanding of science at the forefront as a way of combating both misinformation and research integrity challenges. I'll post a link in the chat to what we're doing with the publication facts label. I can talk about it more. But I see it connected to this question of citizen science because it really is around helping to open up and having the people that are not from within science really understand how things work and be involved and engaged and see value in what we do. I think that this is what's going to ultimately lead to when there are like mishaps or intentional fraud within science, the public will understand that it's a process and that the scientific community is going to help uncover those instances of fraud and do the corrections necessary. And that's just how science ultimately works.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take this opportunity to thank the audience for the Q&As. I'm going to, because of time, move on to our next question, but I do appreciate all the sort of input and questions from the audience. So sort of moving along to the second question is, as all of you panelists will know, and the audience as well, that researchers don't work in isolation. Their research is written up and submitted to journals for publication. And so what responsibilities do publishers have, and what have publishers got in place? And maybe first I could turn that over to you, Natasha.
Sure. So I think a major role of publishers is to ensure rigor and reproducibility in research. And I think open science and at the core of open science, transparency really supports this and contributes to that trust in science. And I think that publishers also are responsible for helping to mitigate those known flaws that have arisen in the system of conducting research and reviewing and disseminating that research. So I think publishers have to identify and acknowledge ways that historically they perhaps have contributed to that system that is not always very historically and currently been very transparent or equitable. And I think a lot of publishers are really working hard to do that, to kind of right those wrongs. Of course, that doesn't happen overnight. I also think we're at a point where a lot of resources and technology are needed to combat fraud and manipulation of data and resources and publications. And this is where I think publishers can be really a force of good and to do things that individuals typically can't. And so things like the STM Integrity Hub and new AI tools, things that make it easier to identify fraudulent science can really be helpful. And I know a lot of publishers are looking into different ways and different tools to help with this.
Thank you, Natasha. And maybe I'd ask you, Kea, as another publisher of a very large publisher of journals, what your perspective is on that question in terms of sort of what responsibilities do publishers have and what do they have in place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that many publishers, as Natasha mentioned, are having to evolve with the times, and obviously human peer review remains at the heart of our integrity process. And we have absolutely no plans to get rid of that aspect of the integrity process. We have over 174,000 external editors working on our journals, 1.2 million reviewers who are lending their expertise. So they're an absolutely integral part of what we do. But we've also added new AI-driven technologies to support those editors because essentially we want to ensure that their focus remains on the science and that they don't have to use their valuable time for quality control, screening processes that could be automated. So we have a number of AI tools to help with technical checks and quality control screening, and in addition, tools that help detect image manipulation, text that has been generated by large language models like ChatGPT. But ultimately, those tools are there to provide support to our editors, but they are not there to make decisions on papers. So the editors still need to make a judgment call when they've reviewed that analysis to see if a manuscript should move forward into peer review. So I think that is, there's still a need for human intervention, but supported by automated and technological tools, because the volume of problematic papers, has certainly increased with paper mills, as Sarah mentioned, and other issues. So I think we need to make sure that we're keeping up with the times.
Okay, thank you both. Sarah and Juan Pablo, is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion?
I appreciate the comments that have already been made on this one.
Okay, great.
Yeah, similarly, I think I would have pointed again to what we are the initiative of what we're doing with the publication facts label. I think publishers have a responsibility to try to be more transparent around the process of what goes on behind, and for us to help educate the public around what are the process that's going on behind. And so that transparency can be a key here, to trust and helping to showcase the processes and checks that have gone on in the background.
Oh, I think we still have a few more minutes, and I would like to sort of perhaps throw out a question to Natasha and Kea in particular. I think a lot of people recognize the importance of peer review. And what sort of training as publishers, do you have? I ask that because when we turn 18, we don't go into a car and drive on the road. We usually take a driving course, and although sometimes I do wonder, what sort of training is in place for people who do peer review, or what do you demand people get training in peer review before they do peer review?
I can go ahead and start and then hand it over to Kaya. For us, it's
Thank
funny
you.
that you mentioned when people turn 18, David, because I think what we've come to the conclusion is that getting this information to people when they're really starting out in their career is the absolute ideal. It is a lot harder, especially when somebody becomes a very established and senior researcher, and they're very clearly good at doing that, to explain to them that they've been doing peer review in a less than ideal, to say the least, manner their entire career. And so we've been doing a lot of outreach and training programs, webinars, workshops for early career researchers. And that also helps to get folks involved in the research community, involved in the journal, but going through that process with them, working through examples, working through different scenarios with them, having that Q&A so that they can learn best practices. And you can tailor that depending on the research community. I mean, obviously, for those researchers who are doing a lot of animal studies or studies with human participants, what you're wanting to look for in peer review is slightly different. There are different categories, so that can be tailored. These are the kind of things that we're doing. And I know that a lot of publishers are also putting videos up online. Some of them are making videos mandatory, which is a very interesting process. We also have to recognize that, and I know that Kaya probably has this problem less in the nature portfolio, but there's especially with predatory journals, there's a huge run on reviewers, making reviewers quite scarce and difficult to find, because they're absolutely inundated with invites and requests to review. And so we have to kind of think about that as well, in terms of coming across as in any way punitive or demanding. We want to make it something that seems like an opportunity, because it is an opportunity, rather than something that feels like an extra thing that they have to do, especially if you're an early career researcher, when there's so many demands on your time already. So it is a bit of a juggling act in that sense.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Kaya, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing many of the same things that you just mentioned, Natasha. Online training modules. We have a training module through Nature Masterclasses. We have other modules online. We're doing early career researcher outreach. But I also wanted to highlight some results from a survey that we did last year. It was the year before, where we asked researchers in the US about access to research integrity training. And the results of that survey were interesting, because there was still quite a large percentage, 43%, who either didn't know that there was any research integrity training available to them, or they knew for sure that there wasn't any training available. And so this kind of highlights an issue at the institutional level, or maybe even the funder level, I'm not sure, where there's some gaps in resources. And so I think, publishers certainly have a role to play, and we can provide training, but I think making sure that researchers have access to research integrity training earlier in their careers is really essential, as Natasha said, and not just having to rely on on their PI or their mentor to provide that training. So, and I think also going back to the point about Natasha's point about peer review shortages. I think that, you know, in an ideal world, there would be more recognition and reward for the act of peer reviewing, and that you know, there's certainly lots of recognition and reward for publications. But peer review is essential, and it's you know, the burden of peer review often falls on senior researchers in North America, Europe, but we really do need to expand peer review training to a broader subsection of the population, and to provide, you know, early career researchers with an incentive to participate, and they you know, their time is very limited. So without that recognition and reward, they may have to make hard choices and decide against accepting an invitation to peer review, just because of you know, the incentives that they have in their professional development structure.
Thank you. Thank you all for these perspectives. And I think that's really good to hear. I'm going to turn it over to the audience now and sort of ask you if you have any questions. I see one of the big things we're seeing globally, but especially in the US, is the politicization of science. People are choosing whether or not to trust science based on their political affiliation. Do you think about this, and how can scientists and publishers fight this mentality? So I'm not sure who would like to take that on. All I do know that recently the US federal government have issued a very long list of words that cannot be used in publication coming from the federal government. Is there somebody in the audience who'd like to speak to that,
Probably.
to the question?
And there are many people here supporting integrity in science, and many people who are invested in this. And I don't want to comment on the political situation because it is something that's currently in flux. But I think the best way to uphold integrity in science is to stick to the principles that we're all following, you know, in terms of COPE guidelines, ICMJE guidelines, you know, adhering to journal guidelines, protocols, you know, all of the things that we basically take for granted in the way that we manage peer review and publications. Nothing in our policy on that regard has changed or will change. So I think, and you know, again, I'm just speaking from this one perspective, but I think there are many people who are also thinking along similar lines.
Thank you, Kea. Anybody else want to add any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I might, at the risk of repeating a little bit of what I've been saying before, but to say that I think that in terms, because it's similar to Kevin's question, also looking at the Q&A, Kevin Sauvé also asked a similar question around, you know, should this change our approach to how it is that we combat these things? And I think what is important here is this question around really making sure that we don't turn on ourselves and that we don't turn inwards, those of us that are participating in science. We have been for a long time. Our research assessment structures have been oriented towards kind of encouraging career academic to be doing their work motivated primarily for their advancement of their academic careers, as opposed to serving the larger public mission of our universities and the public mission of institutions of science. And I think we need to be careful not to be questioning and challenging ourselves and undermining ourselves and giving fodder to some of these perspectives, like anti-scientific perspectives that are out there. So I think that it's on us to make sure that we try to do our work in public, that we try to engage the public, and this is why those sort of citizen science and community science, engaged science is important, as well as making sure that we share what we're doing publicly, and not be afraid of saying, oh, well, if we put it out there, then it's going to be able to be criticized more. I think if we engage and show our value to society by working with them, and not question or challenge ourselves in ways that are constantly undermining what it is that we're doing. I think that's the change in approach that we need to try to head off these very challenging political times.
Thank you. I'm sort of looking at some of the other questions, not in a very systematic manner. My apologies, but one question is, what are alternatives being put into action to make science more open, other than peer-reviewed publications that are mostly behind paywalls? Is there anybody who would like to take that question on?
I mean, I could speak to it just in terms of, you know, some of the open science initiatives that we have going on from a publisher's perspective, but you know, we certainly don't see articles as the sole, you know, output from a research perspective. There are many different research artifacts that come out of a study, data, software, protocols, code, and or you know, even preprints, and we have recently taken the decision to make it mandatory that every author publish a data availability statement, regardless of whether they're sharing data. If they don't have any data to share, then they state that. But at least there's a statement that accompanies each article publication now, that makes it clear whether or not there is data publicly available, and it can be linked from the article to the repository. And we have similar automated pre-printing opportunities through Research Square. We have initiatives with CodeOcean, and now with our partnership with Protocols.io, I'm hoping that will also happen with Protocols. So we're constantly looking for opportunities to link all of the research artifacts to the final publication, the final version of record, and to ensure that those items are cited, that they're assigned a DOI, and that we try to eliminate barriers to making those outputs accessible.
Thank you, Kea. Another question, are there any discussions or approaches on incentivizing knowledge, mobilization, and translation beyond peer-reviewed scholarly publications? Anybody want to take that?
I can speak to that.
Yes, lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
This probably also, you know, it expands on what Kaya was talking about in her response to the last question. And as a university professor, we have an Office of Knowledge Translation or Knowledge Mobilization that encourages us as professors and scholars to make the outputs of our research available in different formats. So scientific and scholarly articles are one format for one kind of audience, our peers, but also ways of bringing the message to members of the public. So we have an office here, for example, that will help us sort of brainstorm ways to do that. And, you know, TED Talks are a great way of thinking about open science and popularizing the results of technology, education, design, science in ways that are digestible for the average person without necessarily using scientific jargon or other kinds of specific terminology that might be expected from fellow scientists. So the idea of incentivizing knowledge mobilization, I can only speak for myself as a scholar, but I can say sort of the message I've heard throughout my career is that those are nice to haves. It's okay to do those things, my blog posts, infographics, panels like this, in addition to, but not instead of, scholarly peer-reviewed publications.
Thank you. I think what I'm going to do, because of time, is I'm going to push on to our third and final question. But I appreciate very much the audience asking questions. We can't get to them all, but we do appreciate your participation, as we'd say in Canada. So the final question is, in a sense, we've had a good discussion about publishers and researchers in the ecosystem, but there are, of course, two other important players, and that is funders and research performing organizations. And I guess the question is, do they have a role, and what could they be doing? And just to give you a little bit of context, earlier this month, I had my annual performance review. I'm not fired yet, but my institution is, like many other institutions, extremely focused on, David, in the last 18 months, how many papers have you published? David, in the last 18 months, how many, what's the impact factor of those publications? And David, are you the senior author in any of these papers? Tell me some more bibliometrics. What's your end index? What's your this? What's your that? And so that's the sort of context. What do research performing organizations and funders have? And I would maybe ask Sarah if she could reflect on this to the audience.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think my experience with merit review at my university has been similar to your experience. I'm at the University of Calgary, where several years ago we signed the Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA. And I think some of the questions around that for us as researchers and professors has been, this is wonderful. And how do we operationalize this in our annual performance reviews? And how do we sort of tell the story of our research? I've been excited to move away, for example, in Canada, from the common CV, the CCV that the CHI Council has required, that was painful to try and prepare, towards a more narrative CV. I just prepared one for a grant application and thought, wow, that's real progress. And maybe to kind of link some of this back to our questions earlier about, research funders, I think we have a terrific blueprint in Canada around research ethics. Every university professor who wants to do research with animal or human subjects has to do a mandatory research ethics tutorial. Is it perfect? No. But we must do that in order to get clearance from our research ethics boards, and then to apply for funding. And so the funders also want to know things like, they keep track of who's done that core tutorial, the Committee on Research Ethics. It's not inconceivable that over time, we might include an additional piece, which is around research integrity. And I think the funding bodies could have a real crucial role to play in ensuring that researchers are trained on research integrity in the same way that we're trained on research ethics. And I actually think Canada's doing a great job of that.
Thank you, Sarah. Juan Pablo, did you want to add to anything that Sarah has said, or have a different perspective?
I think we are seeing that the stories are not always as bleak in terms of research assessment as your story lays it out to be, David. We have seen a lot of progress in conversations around transforming research assessment practices that are spearheaded often at individual units and sometimes at institutions and get sort of institutionalized. We need to recognize that while we can blame the institutions for imposing these things on us, in fact, it's mostly, and the research that we did around research assessment and looking at review, tenure, and promotion practices in the US and Canada, sort of led us to the understanding that at the end of the day, these practices of how we evaluate ourselves and what we try to encourage and create is actually in the hands of ourselves. Like these are tenure and promotion committees are primarily, they're made up of our own peers, and we impose on ourselves these requirements, and there is a reluctance by some to try to move away from those bibliometrics, because everything else requires essentially more work of actually reading and understanding or making sense of both writing that narrative CV of telling your story, but then reading those narrative CVs and making sense of them. And they're challenging to compare one to another. Whereas the numbers give that air of, oh, I can say this number is bigger than this other number, so I can give this person more. So I can say at my own institution, we're pushing right now for having merit review, having sort of annual, or well, we have biannual reviews at my institution. We're pushing to have sort of a standard, you sort of are meeting expectations and everyone gets an equal step reward, and trying to move away from this placing faculty in competition with one another to try to help encourage the move away from that. So there are encouraging stories. I think it's important that we remember that at the end of the day, we're in control of a lot of those assessments, both in review panels and in salary and promotion reviews, that it's really just we're evaluating ourselves and our peers. We need to try to take those opportunities where we have the opportunity to influence, to create a culture where doing things and understanding the faculty job or the researcher's role as being more than producing research outputs. Faculty careers are really much more complex, and we want faculty to be engaged in all kinds of activities that are not just producing knowledge. We want our faculty to be engaged in responding to public policy concerns. We want our faculty to be engaged in addressing and being engaged with communities and trying to address social challenges. Those things naturally lead to less publications because they require a different kind of engagement and output. And the uptake and the impact that those initiatives and efforts can take can be much larger than any number of citations on a paper. But if we don't start collectively understanding that our roles are more broad than this, then we're not going to help create a culture where publishing or working and doing different kinds of things is valued. And so I want to blame the institutions because it's easy to look up and blame it's the man that's pushing me down. But I also have to look across to the left and right and to myself and our peers when we do these evaluations and assessments, that it's often in our control to make those kinds of changes, much more so than we often recognize.
Thank you. Kea and Natasha, anything from your perspectives that you would like to speak to?
Sure. I'll add on a little bit of I'm listening to Juan Pablo and wondering if I'm a bit of a cynic or a realist, but I think that a large part of it might in practice might be funding agencies reassessing their metrics for research assessment. So research assessment reform coming from funding agencies being the ones to kind of put the pressure on institutions to change. It would be great if it came from bottom up. I think in reality, there will be a greater and a quicker shift if we do have funding agencies on board. We see this in Europe, in the UK, this shift, enabling researchers to shift their focus from output to impact. I do think that the direction of the flow kind of does need to be in that direction. Unfortunately, we see organizations like COARA, the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, doing a lot of great work on this. We see funding agencies in the UK Research and Innovation, for example, they're tying funding for universities and institutions to meeting these goals and saying, you know, those universities are setting up entire offices focused on research assessment reform. And they're saying to their researchers, it's no longer, this would really interest you, David and Sarah, at tenure meetings and annual reviews. It's no longer just about how many publications have you had. It's what's the impact of those publications. So what are some case studies that you can come up with? Have this led to any patents? Have these led to new environmental policies? You know, and describe exactly what is happening with your research. I mean, I do think that humans are pretty great at finding opportunities to game a system whenever one exists. And so it'll be interesting to see how this, new reformed research assessment framework might have downsides in the future, but I do think we have to try something. But I do love the idea that we or researchers can empower themselves more and speak up for themselves more. But I do think that, that kind of paradigm shift from funding agencies will really drive it as well.
Thank you.
Let's very quickly respond, David, to say, I've been on the SSHRC, the social sciences research panels for every type of grant, I think, that they have at this point. And the agencies have a role in sort of asking, they set the format of what the CV should come in at. They ask us to evaluate capacity where they have knowledge mobilization as one of the criteria. It actually fits in two of the different criteria for most of the SSHRC grants. But I've been in those meetings where the committee is then still discussing the impact factors of journals or the citation impact, and there is nothing in the guidelines that says that we need to do that. And so that is where the agency is not asking for it at all, or trying to push for that kind of thing at all. But there is a culture that still needs to be shifted, and that's where I want to. Those are places where there's an openness. And when we study these criteria, often they include and allow for all kinds of things. And then we see these bullet points of all of the things that we could do to be considered that we have the capacity to do the work. And it's often the people that are implementing those criteria that are selecting, well, yes, it says 10 things, but the first bullet where it says number of publications and outputs, that one's the one that really matters. We're often making those judgments and applying that conservativeness ourselves. So yeah, so yes, I agree with you, Natasha, but I also think within those funding agencies, often they open up the opportunities, and institutions open up those opportunities. And it's often our own conservatism that holds us back from actually taking advantage of those other 9 bullet points of the kinds of things that are supposed to be considered.
Okay, thank you. Just to be conscious of time, I'm going to turn this over to the audience for Q&A, and I see there are lots of questions here, and I'm going to try to get to some of them. There was one that maybe I missed it. Yes, so many people, including young people, are getting their information and news from non-traditional media sources and social media. Are there any strategies to get the messaging out more effectively using these sources and not relying on traditional media sources to disseminate the messages we want to amplify? Sarah, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I've just gotten a picture in my mind of like a research integrity hero, an influencer on TikTok who talks about, integrity in science. I have yet to meet that person. There's some fantastic scientific sleuths out there whose work I really admire, but I've yet to see that social media influencer, and maybe that's a way for us to level up trust in science.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll move to another question. Earlier in the session, the metric of less than 0.1%, if I recall correctly, for retractions was mentioned in light of the comment a moment ago about trust in science or not as a political position. This brings to mind a similar situation in news media, having trust or not as well in well-established news media with journalistic integrity. This makes me curious about alliances between reputable news media and reputable research publishing. Does the panel have thoughts or insight on this?
Yeah, I can chime in here and say some of the work that we've done on academic integrity in Canada and beyond has shown sometimes that journalists can serve as an early alert system to systemic problems that are later taken up in the research. So I can give you an example. Contract cheating was identified by journalists in newspapers such as the New York Times as early as the 1970s. but it wasn't taken up as a topic of scholarly research until the mid-2000s. So there were a number of journalists across different mainstream publications that had already identified these problems before scholars started to work on it. So reputable journalists can serve as an early alert system to topics that we need to pay attention to as scientists. And we talked about that in our book on academic integrity in Canada, which happens to be open access. So maybe I'll drop a link to it in the chat if anyone's interested.
Thank you, Sarah. Anybody else like to pick up on this question? Okay, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible. Can you comment on researcher also playing a role in advocacy? During COVID, we saw researchers taking strong positions on policy issues and using selected publications to support their views. Seeing scientists as not agnostic to public issues may influence trust. And so I would just say that there was a very interesting title recently of in the Atlantic is a nice article by Marcus and the other Retraction Watch. I forget his name, of course. But Ivan, thank you, Ivan Oransky. But they were basically saying you can get any paper to match your views. So it's a good question, and I really does anybody in the panel want to comment on this issue?
I can take a stab at least trying to speak to it. I don't know if answering the question, but at least try to speak to it. I think it's similar to the question around what we've seen around the news media. I think that, when the news media tries to pretends to be be in the middle and be unbiased and not have a perspective, it only ends up for like that is itself a stance and a perspective and a view that they choose to take. And we've seen the harms that does in our information ecosystem around presenting things and trying to remain agnostic of taking a side on one issue or another. I think that as a research community, we do need to have it's not a politicized science, but to say that we have perspectives based on our knowledge and our experience. And this is one of the responsibilities that we have as researchers, is to say we are experts in our domains. And when there are policy questions that intersect with our domain, then I think we have a responsibility to try to engage and participate in those debates. And that doesn't mean participate in the debates while trying to remain out of them and only provide information from the outside. It means saying, this is, I think, the direction that things should go. What I also think, and I think that there is a caution to be, and a lesson to be learned from COVID, is that we also saw lots of scientists sort of stepping out. Everyone had opinions, and we saw lots of scientists sort of stepping out of their lane and outside of their domain expertise to participate in the conversation in ways that sometimes was harmful, of people trying to say that we're not epidemiologists that knew exactly around the spread and just take a data set and apply my statistical methods from my domain and then try to use the trust and position that we have as scientists and trying to influence the conversation. So I do think we need to be strategic around how we do that. It's not that we want every researcher to be weighing in on every political question, but it is that when the questions intersect with our expertise, I think this is part of what we need to help to shift our sense of what our role and responsibilities are in society, to say we are experts in our domains and we will participate with our perspective around what we think the right policies are for those contexts. And just to be careful to do it only in places where we really do have the expert knowledge. That's going to help reinstitute trust in science around seeing, here's an expert, they know what they're talking about, they're recommending, and it's leading to better policy outcomes. I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you. I'll push on to another question. Can the panel speak to any available training for supporting managers and non-science supervisors on how to foster a culture of scientific integrity. Does anybody want to take that on? Okay. Let me see. Do the panelists have concerns about the quality of external reviews given the sheer number of submissions, not as much increase in the number of potential reviewers, the requested short turnaround requested? I think that's a good question. Actually, one question that I was sort of trying to dig a little bit deeper in general, not in every case, but in general, when I get requests to peer review, I get this magical 2-week turnaround. What is the history of that? Where does that come from? Is it in thin air, or was it something developed 50 years ago and we seem to have been unable to update it in 2025? I don't know, maybe Natasha could. It generally comes from the journal side, the publisher side, because I want to write an article about the 2-week miracle.
Do you want less time or more time, David?
I want to definitely have more time, because
yeah.
I'll just give you one piece of data. I did an audit in June of 2023. And I've just published this in Accountability and Research. In June of 2023, I was asked to peer review 88 articles. And almost all of them asked, "We want your answer in 10 days." So over to you, Natasha.
I mean, I think this ties back into everything we've been talking about here today about reprioritizing things for researchers. So things like peer review, prioritizing, incentivizing peer review. Because right now we're in a system where they say 2 weeks because publishers know that authors who are also researchers want their paper published in a timely manner, because those researchers know that they have to sing for their supper to their institution. And so it becomes this kind of perpetual motion machine where researchers don't have enough time to review, yet they want their paper reviewed quite quickly, and nobody is getting any reward or any prioritization, or at least they don't feel they do. And so it becomes a tricky system. So, I would say that if you want that to change, we have to prioritize and incentivize peer review, and make it equally important to conducting your research, to writing your own papers, to doing all of these other tasks that you're expected to do as a researcher. I don't know, Kaya, you might feel very differently, so I'll let you jump in.
No, I agree with all of that. And I think, the question was about quality of peer review. I think that there's a lot of value in subject expertise, and journals are communities of subject experts, and the editors of journals have been appointed, in part because they are subject experts, but also because they have networks within those communities, and can be persuasive, inviting a high quality review, and calling upon their peers to submit peer reviews. And that is compelling. And we shouldn't underestimate the power that an editor has to invite a commentary from the community in ways that often is not possible through other open peer review methodologies. I think I'm not saying that these systems are perfect. We've obviously seen cases where peer review fails. But I think there is real value to creating communities around journals, communities of experts, society-owned journals that involve the society members. Those are the key experts in their subject area, in their field. And when it works well, that is providing a really high quality level of feedback to the researcher that will ultimately improve their article publication.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the time has arise that I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit for a moment. But I'm going to ask Bipin to launch the first poll for the demographic poll. If people in the audience could take the time, please, to complete that. I think it provides information for CSPC on sort of who's been here and on future endeavors. So if you could take a moment to answer that. I don't believe the results will be displayed, so no worries about that. I think my closing remarks are really first and foremost to thank the panel so much for their expertise and taking the time today to give us 90 minutes and also to share your perspective with the audience. So thank you so much, panel. If I was in reality, I would ask you for a show of hands, but we're virtual, so I don't know what the equivalent is in sort of clapping hands. But anyway, thank you, panel. I also, of course, want to thank the audience who've been very sort of participatory and providing lots of chat comments and also to lots of nice Q&As. And I hope that the panel's expertise in answering them, the questions, has been very helpful. My closing remarks are that I think perhaps that we should be a little bit more optimistic, and that there are mechanisms in place at publishers. There are some mechanisms in place at research performing organizations, and also perhaps they're coming to funders. And so it seems one of the answers probably is a more collective action, and that we shouldn't ask researchers to do something alone. We shouldn't ask publishers. It would be a wonderful opportunity if we could sort of have a meeting in which there are research performing organizations, funders, publishers, and researchers. That would be sort of wearing those hats, be able to communicate, and maybe that goes on and I'm simply not aware of that. I think I'm not sure whether I should say anything else, but I think the Canadian Science Publishers Centre, whether there's upcoming virtual sessions, I don't know, Bipin or Trudy, whether that's something you do or something you want me to do.
David, did you want to give a plug for the conference?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for for mentioning that, Melanie. I'm such a space cadet. So for the audience who are still here, I wanted to mention the 9th World Conference on Research Integrity, which is taking place in May of next year in the wonderful city of Vancouver. The last time this conference was in Canada was in 2013. I have the sort of privilege, I suppose, of co-chairing this meeting. And at this stage, I would just like to encourage everybody to think about coming to the meeting, think about submitting an abstract to the meeting. It's agnostic to discipline. We are interested in issues that are related to research integrity. Because the meeting is being held in Canada, we are trying to focus on 2 specific themes in addition to all of the regular themes. One is Indigenous perspectives and research integrity, and the other is artificial intelligence and research integrity. I think we've discussed some of those issues today, but that's my plug, and I would encourage you to please come and join us. So thank you. We're almost out of time, so I think I'm going to say bye-bye to everyone, and you're getting an extra 3 minutes in your day, so enjoy that, and thank you for participating, and take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
David.